everyone, my name is Lisa. Thanks for joining me on this tutorial. Today we're going to learn how to make the Jack Tar bag by Merchant & Mills. And we're working with this gorgeous canvas floral from Prairie Love Knits. And I'm going to help you figure out how to put this pattern together to make this beautiful bag. So let's get started. I'm going to do a quick overview of what is included in your Prairie Love Knits Jack Tar bucket bag making kit. And first thing we've got is an envelope that has the pre-printed instructions for you, as well as pre-printed pattern pieces. We have our beautiful canvas floral. We have a bag of hardware that includes a magnetic clasp, some D-rings, and some Chicago screws. We have a leather strap that is pre-cut as well as pre-punched for you. Our linen lining fabric, as well as some fusible fleece interfacing that we'll use to make the bag a little more sturdy. I have the instructions for the Jack Tar bag here, and I'll just quickly go over what's included in the instructions. We have our list of pattern pieces that we'll be using, cutting layouts to maximize your fabric, some helpful hints on pattern markings for grain line and notches, tips for using oilskin. We're using canvas, so we won't need to refer to this. Some information about the terms that are used in the instructions. It indicates the seam allowance is 1.5 centimeters. There are some exceptions to that where we'll be stitching within the seam allowance. And then also a fabric key, a legend that tells you what they're referring to when they're talking about the right side of the fabric or the wrong side. And then the instructions. Our pocket construction will be slightly different from the instructions. We'll be doing 2 pieces for the pocket, so that will vary a little bit. We've got one side of instructions, and then this side of the instructions goes over attaching the facing, the magnetic clasp, as well as the lining and the straps. So I've got my pattern pieces all cut out. I cut them out along the blue line here, and I'm just going to go over each piece. We've got piece number 1, which is for the front and back of the bag. We'll cut 2 out of your floral main canvas, as well as 2 out of your fusible fleece interfacing. Piece 2 is the oval bucket base, and that says we'll cut 1 out of self, but they really mean the main print, 1 out of your linen lining, as well as we'll cut out 1 of our interfacing. Piece number 3 is our top facing piece. We'll cut out 2 of our print of our floral fabric. You can see it has all these nice notches that will help us line everything up. So we'll be doing little snips in the fabric. Piece 4 is our tab piece, and we'll cut that out of the floral fabric, and that's what we'll attach the D-rings to attach our leather strap to. Piece 5 is our pocket piece. Here it says cut 1 in the lining, but we're going to cut 1 in the lining as well as 1 out of our main to make a thicker, sturdier pocket. So our construction will vary slightly from the pattern instructions, and this pattern piece also indicates where we'll be doing our stitching to create our compartments in our pocket. Piece 6 is our front and back lining pattern piece, and that will be cutting out of our linen. It also has a line here to indicate where we'll be putting our pocket. Piece 7 is our shoulder strap piece. We won't be using that for the construction of this bag because we have our lovely leather strap that's been included in the kit. But if you decide to make this pattern again, you can use this piece to cut out a leather strap, and it has markings for where you would punch out the holes for your rivets or your Chicago screws. And piece 8 here is our handles. If you're going to do the optional extra handles, you'll be cutting out 2 of your floral fabric using that piece. So now I'm off to cut out my fabric. So I'm starting to cut out my fabric, and I've got this lovely canvas laid out. It's a non-directional fabric, so you can choose whether you like it one way or the other. It doesn't matter which way you have it. I've got it laid out according to the grain line of the canvas and on top of my cutting mat. I've got my pattern held down with some tile pattern weights, and I'm going to be using my rotary cutter and a straight edge to cut the pattern pieces out, and some scissors to cut out the notches for the handle positions and any other notches for aligning the pieces when we're sewing. Okay, so here's our first pattern piece that I've gone ahead and cut out in double. So I've got 2 layers of fabric here underneath my pattern piece, and cut out all the way around. And now I'm going to start cutting the notches in the along the edge here. And so I'm just going to leave the pattern piece on top of the fabric and cut a small little snip in the fabric. And you want it to just be small so that it stays within the seam allowance, and that'll help us with lining things up as we go along here. So just a tiny little snip there. One tip that might help you stay organized while you're cutting is to create a cut list that will tell you how many of each pattern piece in which fabric or interfacing you need. And then as you go along, just check off what you've got so that you don't have to run back to your cutting table as you're sewing. And it just makes things a little more organized here. So I'm almost through cutting, and then we'll get on to the sewing part. Our next step is to add interfacing to our front and back piece 1 of our main fabric, as well as piece 2 on our main fabric. So I'm at my ironing table, and I'm getting ready to apply the fusible fleece interfacing to the main bag print. And the interfacing has 2 sides. You'll have a nice smooth side and a rough side, and the rough side is what has the glue on it. So you're going to want to put the rough side to the wrong side, or the back side of your main material here. So we're going to place those sides together, rough side to the wrong side, and then place a pressing cloth over top so it doesn't get too hot under there. And I've got my iron set to medium heat with steam. And then you're just going to go along and push it down with medium pressure, letting it sit in an area for about 10 to 15 seconds, and then moving it along until the whole piece has been interfaced. And then if you find that it hasn't adhered properly, we can apply more heat from the right side after this is done. Hi everyone! So we're here at the sewing machine and we're ready to get started with the construction of our bag. And I've got my pocket piece as the first piece we're going to start working with. So I've got my linen lining and my canvas floral pinned together with wonder clips along the top edge and the bottom edge. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew those together, right sides together, with a straight stitch, only along the top and bottom edge, and we're not going to sew the side edges just yet. I've got my sewing machine set to a straight stitch with a stitch length of 2.5, and I'm using universal needles because we're using a woven fabric, and we're going to use a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters, and I've got a marking on my needle plate for that, so I'll just follow that. And then when we're done sewing, we're going to turn the pocket right side out and give it a good press with the iron. I've done sewing my pocket, and I turned it right sides out and gave it a really good pressing with my iron to get these top and bottom edges really nice and crisp. And I've also gone ahead and top stitched the top edge of the pocket 1/8 of an inch down from the top seam. And that's just giving it a nice crisp look. Really looks nice and finished. The next thing that I've already done is I've placed wonder clips at the marking points on our pattern piece for our vertical stitch lines here. And that's just going to help us when we're doing our stitching here. As well as I've placed wonder clips on the liner piece at the bottom where the pocket's going to be lined up. So we're going to take our pocket piece that we've stitched, line it up on our lining piece, and using clips or pins, you can just clip it in place. And then what we're going to do is we're going to edge stitch it along the bottom edge. So we're going to stitch the pocket to the liner along the bottom edge, and we're also going to do our vertical stitches to create our compartments in our pocket. So between the lining, the markings, these little clips on the pocket piece. And then we're ready to go on to the next step. When you're stitching your vertical seams of the pocket, you want to make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and end of your seam, and that's just going to make sure your stitches don't come undone and give your pockets a little bit more strength. And there you go. So here's our liner with our pocket piece attached. My bottom is edge stitched about 1/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge, as well as the vertical seams creating the compartments are done. You can see I've chosen to place my floral fabric on the inside, but you can do it whichever way you want. If you want to see that floral on the inside of your bag, that would be lovely too. These stitches, these sides aren't stitched just yet. They'll get stitched down when we sew our lining pieces together in the next step. Okay, so our next step is to sew the two lining pieces together. So I've got my two lining pieces right sides together, and we're going to be sewing the vertical seams on the short edges. On one side, you're going to sew with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and we're going to go from top to bottom. And on the other side, which I've done already, is we're going to sew 1/3 of the way with our 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and back stitch at the end. And we're going to leave about a 3-inch hole here for turning the bag right side out when we get to that step. And then you're going to have another seam down here, another line of stitching here, and back stitch at the beginning and end. So I've done that, and we've got our hole here for turning the bag around. So I'll finish the other side, and then we'll go to the next step. So I've got my lining pieces still inside out, and I'm pressing the seams so that they lay flat. Okay, so here we are. We have our two lining pieces, front and back, stitched together, and our next step is to add a row of stay stitching along the bottom edge of our lining piece. So make sure that your lining is oriented the right way. Make sure you're stitching along the bottom and not along the top. And a stay stitch is just a regular stitch that is used to add some strength, and it's within our seam allowance. So we're going to, our normal seam allowance is 1.5 centimeters, and this will be just a little bit less than that. So 1.4 they say in the instructions. And we're going to use the same regular straight stitch. And then when we're going through just one single layer of the lining, we're going to go around the whole loop of the lining with our stay stitch, and then we're going to snip up into this lining piece, right almost up to that stay stitch. And that's going to help us attach this liner piece to the circular base of the bag. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch all the way around, and then we'll clip the base of the bag to the lining pieces. So here I've got the lining piece and the base piece attached to each other, right sides together. I've matched up the 4 quarter points of the oval base with the side seams and the center points of the front and back of the liner. And I've started attaching the two with wonder clips. You can see my stay stitching here, as well as my snips almost all the way up to the stay stitching. And that's going to help us attach the straight edge of the lining to the round edge of the base. We're going to do that all the way around the oval base. We're going to clip them together, right sides together, and then I'm going to add some pins in there just so that nothing shifts around. And I'm going to stitch those together with my regular 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. And so we'll use this stay stitch as a guide, and I'm going to stitch just outside of that so that we won't see the stay stitching in our lining when we're all done. So here it is, my lining's attached to my base all the way around, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Here we are at our next step, where we're going to make our handles and the tabs. I've got my handles and tab pieces, and we're going to fold them so that they're right sides together and clip or pin along the long straight edge here of all 4 pieces. And there is only a 1 centimeter seam allowance for the tabs, a little bit smaller than usual, and the normal 1.5 centimeter seam allowance for our handle straps. So go ahead and do a straight stitch along the long edge of all 4 pieces, and then we'll turn them right sides out and give them a good press with our iron. So here we are with the handles and the tabs that I've made and pressed on my iron. I've made sure that the seam is down the back middle of each piece, and I've split it so that the seam allowance goes on both sides there in the middle. You can see it. It's not on one side or the other. I've split it so that it's even across. And I've gone ahead and edge stitched my tabs and my handle here, and I've done maybe 1/16 of an inch from the edge all the way along both long edges there. So I've got one more to do, and then we'll set these aside for later. We're at our next step here, where we're going to start working with our main front and back pieces of the canvas material that's been interfaced already. And our first step is to place them right sides together and match up, make sure you're matching up the top edge where we've done the notches. And we're going to sew along each side seam that I've got clipped here with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. And then we'll move along to the bottom edge, where we'll do that same stay stitching procedure that we did on the lining. And that's going to be exactly the same, stitching through one layer at approximately 1.4 centimeters seam allowance. And we'll sew around the bottom loop and then snip into towards the stay stitching line. And then we'll move along to attach the base. So I'm going to get started on that, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Okay, so I've gone ahead and stitched the front and back of our main floral canvas along the sides I've pressed those seams flat, and I've done a stay stitch all the way around the bottom loop of the bag, and I've snipped into the bottom. So now we're going to attach our round or oval base to the front and back of the mane, just the same way that we did the lining. And I've marked the quarter points of the bag as well as the quarter points of the oval, and I'm just going to go ahead and match those up, add clips and pins all the way around, and stitch with our normal 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then we'll turn it right side out and see how it looks. So here we have the bag, exterior turned right side out, and it's gonna fit everything because it's such a nice big size. And our next step is attaching the handles and tabs that we made previously. So I've just placed clips at those notches that we cut when we were cutting our fabric out, just to show you where they're gonna go. I've done one side already here, just placed the handle, and you can see at the top here the seam is showing. So when the handle is up, the seam will not be showing. So that's the way you should be placing your handles here. And just make sure that they don't get twisted around. The instructions have a nice little diagram about how the handles should lay like that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on the other side. And then we're going to also put our tabs on and use our D-rings from the hardware kit. So you can put your D-ring into your tab that we've sewn already, and you want to make sure that your seam is on the inside, so seams together, and your D-ring will just be attached like that, and then that will get centered on the side seam here, and we can just clip that into place. And I'll do the other one, and then we'll just add a stay stitch along. You can back stitch at the beginning and end, and put the stay stitch within your seam allowance on all of these points where the handles and tabs are meeting the top of the bag here. So I'm going to go all the way around and stitch everything, and then we'll move on to the next part. Here's the top of the bag with the handles and the tabs here attached. You can see I've just got them stitched on, reinforced back in front here. And next part we're going to work on is our facing. So I've got my facing pieces matched up right sides together, and make sure that you've got them, the top edge has the notches cut out for it to match up with the handles on the bag. So just make sure that you've matched up the right sides. Only one edge has the notches, so I've got those there. And I've got them pinned at the sides, so I'm just going to stitch them together with our regular seam allowance, and then press that seam open, and we're going to match this up with the top of the bag once that's done. So here we are with the bag that I've attached the facing to the top edge of the exterior portion of the bag, and matching the side seams and matching all of the notches that were clipped on the top of the bag and the facing. And I've just clipped it together with Wonder Clips, and now I'm going to go ahead and stitch it together with our regular seam allowance, and then we will flip the facing up and edge stitch it so that it's got a nice flat finish there. So that's what it looks like right now, and then I'll show you what it looks like after I've done the next step. When going over the seams where we have our handles and multiple layers of fabric, I like to go nice and slow so that I don't break a needle, and I also like to go back and forth a few times just to reinforce that seam, as it's going to be bearing all the weight when our bag is full of all of our stuff. So that's just one thing I like to do, is go back and forth at each joint of either handle or the tab there, and just go nice and slow. So here's the top facing after I've gone ahead and edge stitched it, and as you can see here, I've edge stitched fairly close to that seam, and I've made sure not to edge stitch it with the handles down. The handles have to be away from that, as well as our tabs here. They shouldn't be included in the edge stitching portion. And our next step is to find our center line here and make a marking for where our magnetic clasp is going to go. The instructions say to put it 4 centimeters down from the top edge, in line with your notch that is already in place there. So I've gone ahead and marked that 4 centimeters down, and you can either use chalk or a water erasable marker, fabric marker, whatever you've got. Just make a nice little mark there so that you know where to put your clasp through. And as well as that mark, we're going to also add another piece of fusible fleece interfacing to the back side of this facing, right where that magnetic clasp is going to go. I just cut something from my scraps, and I'm going to fuse that to the back side, and then we'll talk about how the clasps go in. So I've gone ahead and added a little scrap piece of fusible fleece interfacing to the back side of this facing piece, and I've aligned it over where the magnetic clasp is going to go, and that's just going to give the clasp a little more strength. So the magnetic clasps come in these sets. You've got a male end with a washer and a female end with a washer. So they've got these prongs on the back here, and we're going to make tiny little slits in the fabric that these metal prongs will go through. You don't want to make those slits too big, otherwise your fabric might rip. And I've gone ahead and done that already. I'm going to push this washer through to the back side, or push the prongs through to the back side, sorry. And we're going to cover that up with a washer here, and then we just bend them back like that. So then one side of your magnetic clasp is done, and I'll go ahead and do the other side. So our next step is to attach the lining, and all you need to do is attach them right sides together. You'll attach the lining to the facing here, and I've gone and matched all of the notches along that edge and clipped them, and we're going to stitch it with our regular 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then we'll turn the bag out through the hole that we left in the lining here when we were stitching that side together. All right, so I've gone ahead and flipped the bag out through that hole that we left in the lining, and it was quite a workout. I think for the next one I do, I'll leave that opening slightly bigger, so probably around 5 inches would be better. Just make it easier to turn everything through. And now, but I did it, so now I'll be able to edge stitch this opening closed, and the bag is almost done and it's looking really good. So I've got my bag turned right side out, and I'm going to give this top edge, this seam here, a good press all the way around, and then we can go ahead and attach the leather straps. Our last step is attaching the leather strap to the D-rings, and all you have to do is push the strap through the D-ring and make sure that this side is aligned with the inside of the bag. You don't want to have this showing on the outside. And then you want to align your holes, nice pre-punched holes. And you can see here I've got one done already. And you want the flat side on the outside of your strap. This is how they come in two pieces. So you've got flat ones and then ones that have the notch in there. And so the flat goes through one side, the notch side goes through the other, and they literally thread into one another. And you can use a flathead screwdriver. I'm using the screwdriver that comes with my sewing machine. And another option for you to add is a dab of glue inside there. Just a tiny little bit of glue to help, if you have it, it helps to keep these screws from loosening over time. But you don't really need it. If you tighten it really, really well, you should be just fine. So here we have our finished bag, and I love it. We have our leather strap attached using these awesome Chicago screws. It made it so easy to go through both layers of this thick leather strap, and it feels really secure and sturdy. We also have our beautiful canvas straps here as another alternative for carrying the bag if you don't want to use the shoulder strap, but they're completely optional if you decide not to do them. We have our magnetic clasp here as our closure. It makes the bag look really finished and polished. On the inside, we have our linen lining and our really functional deep pockets there to hold everything, as well as just the deep bucket bag in the middle there. We've got room for holding just about anything in there. So I hope you guys had a lot of fun following along on the tutorial, and I can't wait to see all your finished bags.